They told her the gorilla wouldn't recognize her anymore. But what happened next made everyone in the room stop breathing. The massive glass enclosure trembled as Koba slammed his hands against it again, the deep thud echoing across the concrete floor like distant thunder, and just inches away on the other side stood Emily Carter, frozen in place, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling as they hovered in the air, unsure whether to reach forward or pull back, while the security team behind her exchanged uneasy glances, one of them whispering under his breath that this was exactly what they had warned her about, that this was why no one was supposed to step this close. Not anymore, not after everything that had changed. But Emily didn't respond. She couldn't, because all she could see was Koba's eyes locked onto hers, intense, searching, almost too human to look away from. And for a moment the entire world outside that glass seemed to disappear, replaced by the heavy silence of something unspoken, something unresolved, something that had been waiting for years to finally surface. Yet the tension in the room only tightened as Koba let out a low, rumbling sound deep in his chest, not loud, not aggressive, but enough to make the nearest guard instinctively step back, his hand hovering near the emergency alarm, ready to act if anything went wrong, while another staff member shook his head slowly, whispering that the animal hadn't reacted like this to anyone in months, that he barely acknowledged even the people who fed him. And yet here he was, pacing now, back and forth, each step heavy and deliberate, his massive frame casting shifting shadows across the enclosure walls, his gaze never leaving Emily for even a second, as if trying to understand something, or remember something just out of reach. And Emily felt her chest tighten as memories flickered through her mind in flashes too fast to hold on to. The warmth of a tiny hand gripping her finger, the soft sounds of a young gorilla learning to trust, the quiet nights spent sitting beside him when he wouldn't sleep, and for a split second she almost stepped forward, almost pressed her palm against the glass. But then Koba suddenly stopped moving, completely still, his entire body rigid, his eyes widening just slightly, as if something had shifted inside him. And that was when the room fell completely silent. No footsteps, no whispers, no movement at all. Just the faint hum of the overhead lights and the sound of Emily's heartbeat pounding in her ears, as Koba slowly lifted one hand and pressed it against the glass, directly in front of her, the sheer size of it dwarfing her own reflection staring back at her from the other side. And no one dared to say a word, because no one knew what would happen next. Not the guards, not the staff, and certainly not Emily herself, standing there face to face with the one being she had once called family, now separated by nothing more than a barrier that suddenly felt far too thin to contain whatever was about to unfold. 3 hours earlier, the tension had not yet filled the room, and the glass between them had felt like just another barrier instead of a fragile line holding back something unknown. As Emily Carter stood outside the restricted access corridor, gripping a visitor badge that felt far heavier than it should, her name printed clearly beneath a bold red label that read "Authorized under supervision." Though nothing about this visit felt controlled or safe, and the man beside her, a senior handler named Daniel Brooks, had already explained the risks twice, his tone calm but firm, as if repeating the warning might somehow convince her to turn back before it was too late. Because Koba was no longer the young animal she had raised, no longer the curious, gentle presence that used to follow her from room to room, watching her every move with wide, trusting eyes. And Daniel made that clear as he folded his arms and looked at her carefully, saying that over the past 2 years Koba had changed in ways no one could fully predict, that he had become more withdrawn, more reactive, that even the regular staff kept a distance now, interacting only through routine feeding and observation. And Emily listened without interrupting, her expression steady, though her hands betrayed her, fingers tightening slightly around the badge as if holding onto something deeper than the plastic card itself. Because what Daniel did not understand was that for Emily this was not just a visit. It was something unfinished, something that had been waiting for far too long. And when he asked her one final time if she was absolutely certain she wanted to go through with this, she nodded without hesitation, even as another staff member nearby exchanged a doubtful look, quietly muttering that people always thought animals would remember them the way humans did, and that it rarely worked out that way. But Emily did not respond to that either. because her mind was already somewhere else, somewhere years back in a much smaller enclosure filled with soft blankets and quiet sounds, where Koba had once been small enough to fit in her arms, where his world had been simple and safe and centered entirely around the people who cared for him, especially her. And as she stood there now, she could still remember the first time he had reached for her. His tiny hand wrapping around her finger with a grip that was surprisingly strong for such a small creature. And how that single moment had changed everything. How it had turned routine care into something personal, something that blurred the line between responsibility and connection. And that connection had only grown stronger with time, through long hours of feeding, cleaning, observing, and simply sitting beside him in silence, letting him get used to her presence, her voice, her scent. Until eventually he no longer hesitated when she entered the room, no longer watched her from a distance, but moved toward her with a kind of quiet certainty that had never needed explanation. And that was the version of Koba she carried with her now as Daniel finally stepped aside and motioned toward the secured door ahead, the one that led deeper into the facility. His expression serious as he reminded her that once she went through, there would be no sudden movements, no attempts to close distance, no assumptions about how the animal might react, and Emily nodded again, though her eyes had already shifted forward, focused on the path ahead, as if nothing else mattered anymore. And as the heavy door unlocked with a sharp mechanical click that echoed down the hallway, she took a slow breath and stepped forward, unaware that within the next few minutes everything she believed about that bond would be tested in a way she could never have prepared for. The corridor beyond the secured door felt colder than the rest of the facility, the air heavier, quieter, as if even sound moved more carefully in this part of the building. And Emily Carter noticed it immediately as her footsteps echoed softly against the polished concrete floor, each step measured, deliberate, while Daniel Brooks walked slightly behind her now, no longer leading but watching closely, as though ready to intervene at the slightest sign that something was not right. And along the walls were reinforced observation windows, each one revealing glimpses of other enclosures, other animals, but none of them held her attention for more than a second, because at the end of the corridor was the one place that mattered, the enclosure that housed Koba, and even before she reached it, she could feel a strange tension building in her chest, a mix of anticipation and uncertainty that made it difficult to take a full breath. While Daniel finally spoke again, his voice lower this time, almost cautious, explaining that Koba had developed patterns over the past year, that he often stayed near the far side of his enclosure during the mornings, avoiding direct contact, avoiding eye-level interactions, and that any deviation from that behavior was usually a sign that something had triggered him, though what exactly that meant was never entirely clear. And Emily listened but did not slow down, her eyes fixed ahead, because with every step the memories grew stronger, more vivid, as if the past was pulling her forward instead of holding her back. And when they finally reached the final observation window, she stopped, not abruptly, but as if something inside her had quietly told her that this was the moment. And for a brief second she hesitated, her hand hovering near the edge of the glass, not touching it yet, just close enough to feel the faint coolness radiating from its surface. And then she looked inside, expecting distance, expecting emptiness, expecting the version of Koba that Daniel had described, withdrawn and unreachable. But what she saw instead made her heart skip in a way she could not explain, because Koba was not at the far side of the enclosure. He was already there, only a few feet away from the glass, standing still, facing directly toward her, as if he had known she was coming long before she arrived. And for a moment neither of them moved, the space between them filled with a silence that felt almost intentional, as though both sides were waiting for something unspoken to happen first. While behind her, Daniel took a small step closer, his posture tightening as he noticed the same thing, quietly saying that this was unusual, that Koba was never this close at this time of day, that something about this was not following the pattern. And Emily felt that warning settle in her mind, but it did not push her back. It only made the moment feel heavier, more important, because Koba's eyes were fixed on her in a way that felt different from simple curiosity. There was focus there, intensity, something deeper that she could not immediately define. And then he moved, not suddenly, not aggressively, but with a slow, deliberate step forward that brought him even closer to the glass, his massive form filling her entire view. and Emily felt her breath catch again as her instincts told her to step back. But she did not. She stayed exactly where she was, her hand still hovering just inches from the surface, as if waiting for permission from something she could not see, while Koba tilted his head slightly, studying her face, his gaze shifting in small, precise movements as though searching for recognition in details that time had tried to erase. And Daniel's voice came again from behind her, quieter now, more tense, reminding her not to make any sudden movements, not to assume anything about what the animal might do next. But Emily barely heard him, because in that moment, all she could feel was the weight of Koba's attention, the unmistakable sense that something was about to happen, something that would define whether the bond they once had still existed or had been lost, somewhere in the years between. And as Koba slowly lifted his hand again, bringing it closer to the glass with a measured, almost careful motion, the entire corridor seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move that no one could predict. Emily could feel the moment stretching longer than it should, as if time itself had slowed under the weight of what was unfolding in front of her. And even though every instinct in the room was quietly urging caution, something deeper inside her was pulling in the opposite direction, telling her to stay, to not break whatever fragile connection was forming between them. And Koba's hand hovered just inches from the glass now, massive and steady, his fingers slightly curled as though hesitating, in a way that did not match the strength of his body. And Emily finally let her own hand move forward, slowly, carefully, until her palm rested flat against the cool surface, the barrier the only thing separating them. And for a brief second nothing happened, no sound, no movement, just the faint reflection of her hand mirrored against his. And then Koba closed the remaining distance, pressing his palm against the exact spot where hers was, aligning perfectly, as if guided by memory rather than instinct. And a quiet murmur moved through the staff behind her, not loud enough to break the moment, but enough to reveal their disbelief, because this was not behavior they had seen before, not from him, not like this. And Daniel took another step forward, his voice low but urgent as he reminded Emily that contact, even through glass, could trigger unpredictable responses, that she needed to be ready to step back if anything changed. But Emily did not move. She could not, because the pressure of Koba's hand against the glass was firm yet controlled, not forceful, not erratic, but deliberate, almost careful. And she felt something shift inside her, something that made the years between them feel thinner, less permanent than she had feared. And Koba leaned closer now, his face moving toward the glass, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if focusing on details that had once been familiar, the curve of her face, the way she stood, the rhythm of her breathing. And Emily felt her throat tighten as she whispered his name under her breath, not loud enough for anyone else to hear, but enough that it seemed to reach him in a way that defied logic. Because Koba froze for a split second, his entire body still, his gaze locking onto hers with a sudden intensity that made the room feel even smaller, more confined. And then he made a sound, low and soft, almost questioning. Nothing like the earlier rumble that had unsettled the staff, but something closer to recognition or confusion, as if part of him was trying to connect the present with something long buried in the past. And behind her one of the handlers shook his head slightly, whispering that this was not normal, that animals did not hold on to memories like this, not after so much time, not after such a complete change in environment and routine. But Daniel did not respond, because even he could see that something about this moment did not fit the explanations they were used to relying on. And Emily slowly adjusted her hand, sliding it just a fraction across the glass, testing, watching. And Koba followed the movement instantly, mirroring her with precision, his hand moving in sync with hers, as if the connection between them was guiding both sides at once. And the tension in the room shifted again, no longer just fear, but something more uncertain, something that blurred the line between caution and awe. And yet beneath it all there was still a question hanging, unspoken, because while this moment felt controlled, felt calm, there was no way to know what would happen next. No way to predict whether this fragile recognition would hold or suddenly break. And as Koba's posture changed slightly, his shoulders rising, his weight shifting forward, Emily felt the first real flicker of doubt cross her mind. Not enough to step away, but enough to remind her that this was not the same small creature she once held in her arms. that this was something far more powerful, far more unpredictable. And as his hand pressed harder against the glass for just a moment longer before slowly pulling back, the silence returned again, heavier than before, carrying with it the sense that the next move would change everything. Koba's hand slowly lowered from the glass, but his eyes did not leave Emily for even a second, and that was what unsettled the room the most. Not the movement itself, but the stillness that followed, the kind of stillness that felt like it was holding something back, something not yet revealed, and Emily felt it too. That subtle shift in the air, like the moment just before a storm changes direction, quiet but heavy with meaning. And she hesitated for the first time, her hand still resting lightly against the glass as if unsure whether to pull away or stay connected, while behind her Daniel exhaled slowly, almost relieved, whispering that this might be the safest point to step back, to end the interaction while it was still calm, still controlled. But Emily did not move, because something about Koba's posture was different now, his shoulders slightly hunched forward, his head tilted in a way that did not match confusion or aggression, but something more focused, more intentional. And then he turned his head slightly, just enough to glance toward the far side of the enclosure, not fully breaking eye contact, just enough to acknowledge something beyond her, and Emily followed that glance instinctively, her eyes shifting to where he had looked, but she saw nothing out of place, just the familiar layout of the habitat, the climbing structures, the shaded corner, the feeding area, all exactly as they should be. And when she looked back at him, Koba had already moved, stepping away from the glass with a sudden decisiveness that caused a ripple of tension to pass through the staff behind her, one of them stepping closer as if preparing for a change in behavior, while Daniel's voice came sharper now, telling her to stay alert. That sudden disengagement could mean agitation, could mean unpredictability, but Emily remained still, watching as Koba paced a few steps away, his movements not frantic, not aggressive, but purposeful, as if following a thought she could not see. And then he stopped again, turning back toward her, his gaze locking onto hers once more, and for a moment it felt like the connection had snapped, like whatever recognition had been there was gone, replaced by something unreadable, something distant, and Emily felt her chest tighten, that brief fear creeping in that maybe the others had been right, that memory did not survive the way she believed it did, that whatever they had once shared had been erased by time and distance. But then Koba did something unexpected. He lifted one hand again, not toward the glass this time, but toward his own chest, pressing it lightly against himself before lowering it again, the motion slow and deliberate, almost like a signal, and Emily blinked, unsure if she had understood it correctly, unsure if it meant anything at all, while behind her one of the handlers whispered that this behavior had not been observed before, that it did not match any recorded pattern, and Daniel frowned slightly, his focus sharpening as he watched closely, clearly trying to interpret what was happening. But Koba did not repeat the gesture. Instead, he turned once more, this time moving toward the far corner of the enclosure, stopping briefly to look back at Emily, as if expecting something, waiting for something. And that was when Emily felt it, a quiet realization forming beneath the confusion, a sense that this was not random, that this was not a withdrawal or a loss of connection, but something else entirely, something that felt almost like an invitation, though she could not yet understand to what. And as Koba stood there, still watching her from across the enclosure, the distance between them suddenly felt larger than the glass that separated them, filled with a question that no one in the room could answer, and the silence that followed carried a new kind of tension, one that was no longer about fear of what he might do, but uncertainty about what he was trying to show her. For a moment, no one moved, as if the entire room was caught between two possibilities that could not exist at the same time, and Emily stood there staring at Koba across the enclosure, her mind racing to make sense of what she had just seen, because the gesture he made was not random, it was not instinctive, it was deliberate, and something about it felt familiar in a way she could not immediately explain. While behind her Daniel took a cautious step forward, his voice low but firm as he reminded her that they had reached the limit of what was considered safe interaction, that if the animal was moving away and showing signs of shifting behavior, it was best to disengage before things escalated. But Emily barely registered the words, because Koba was still watching her, still waiting, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and then suddenly he moved again, this time faster than before, covering the distance between himself and the glass in just a few powerful strides, causing a sharp intake of breath from the staff behind her, one of them instinctively reaching for the emergency control panel, while Daniel raised his voice slightly, telling Emily to step back immediately, but she did not move. She could not, because something in Koba's movement did not feel like a threat. It felt urgent, intentional, as if he was trying to close the distance not out of aggression, but out of necessity. And when he reached the glass, he stopped abruptly, his hand rising once more, but instead of pressing it flat like before, he tapped the surface twice, firm but controlled, then paused. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a wave of confusion through her, because this was not behavior she remembered, not something she had taught him, and yet it carried a sense of purpose that was impossible to ignore. And then he turned his head again, sharper this time, glancing back toward that same far corner of the enclosure, before looking at her again, repeating the motion with more urgency, as if trying to direct her attention, to show her something she had missed. And Emily felt her breath catch as realization began to form, slow but undeniable, that this was not about recognition alone. This was communication, not in words, not in anything easily explained, but in actions, in patterns, in intent. And her eyes followed his gaze again, scanning the enclosure more carefully this time, searching for anything out of place, anything that could explain what he was trying to show her, while the staff behind her grew more uneasy, their voices overlapping now, questioning whether the behavior was escalating, whether the animal was becoming overstimulated, whether they needed to intervene. But Daniel held up a hand to silence them, his focus narrowing as he watched closely, because even he could see that something about this moment was different, that Koba was not reacting unpredictably. He was repeating, signaling, insisting, and then Emily saw it. Not immediately, not clearly at first, but just enough to make her heart skip, a small detail near the edge of the enclosure that did not belong, something partially hidden, something she had overlooked before. And as she leaned slightly closer to the glass, trying to get a better view, Koba responded instantly, tapping the glass again, louder this time, his entire posture shifting forward with a kind of controlled urgency that sent a ripple of tension through the room. And Emily realized in that moment that whatever Koba was trying to show her, it was important enough. That he had broken his usual patterns, important enough to risk this level of engagement. And the silence that followed was no longer filled with fear of what he might do, but with the growing weight of a question that demanded an answer, because for the first time since she arrived, Emily was no longer just trying to see if Koba remembered her. She was trying to understand what he was trying to tell her. Emily's eyes locked onto the faint shape near the edge of the enclosure, her mind struggling to fully process what she was seeing as the details slowly came into focus. And for a second she questioned herself, wondering if it was just a trick of the light or her imagination filling in gaps under pressure. But Koba's reaction removed all doubt, because the moment she leaned closer, trying to see more clearly, he responded again with that same deliberate urgency, tapping the glass once more and shifting his body slightly to keep her attention fixed on that exact spot. And the tension behind her grew instantly, voices overlapping as the staff tried to interpret what was happening, some insisting that the animal was becoming overstimulated, that the interaction had gone on too long, while others hesitated, unsure, because what they were witnessing did not match any known pattern. And Daniel stepped forward again, closer this time, his voice firmer as he told Emily they needed to stop, that whatever was happening could escalate at any moment. But she shook her head slightly, not even turning to look at him, because now she could see it clearly, a small, subtle movement near the base of the enclosure structure, something that did not belong to the environment, something alive. And her breath caught as the realization hit her all at once, because it was not just an object, not just debris or shadow. It was a small figure, barely visible, tucked into a space that was almost completely hidden from normal view. And Koba had been trying to show it to her the entire time. And as that understanding settled in, a wave of shock moved through her so quickly that she felt her knees weaken for just a second, while behind her Daniel followed her gaze, his expression shifting instantly from caution to concern as he saw the same thing. And the room changed in an instant. The tension no longer centered on Koba's behavior, but on what had just been revealed, because the presence of something unexpected inside the enclosure raised questions none of them were prepared to answer, and Koba moved again, not toward Emily this time, but positioning himself slightly between her line of sight and the rest of the enclosure, his posture changing in a way that felt protective rather than defensive, as if he was guarding that small, hidden presence from everything else around it. And Emily felt her chest tighten with a mix of emotions she could not separate: relief that Koba had not forgotten her, confusion at what he was trying to communicate, and a growing sense of urgency that whatever was happening here mattered far more than anyone had realized. And she took a small step closer to the glass, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke his name again. This time with a different tone, not questioning, not testing, but acknowledging, as if telling him she understood. And Koba reacted immediately, his gaze softening just slightly, his body lowering a fraction as the tension in his shoulders eased, confirming what she had just realized, that he was not acting out of confusion or unpredictability. He was acting with purpose, guiding her, showing her something that no one else had seen. And behind her the staff moved quickly now, the earlier uncertainty replaced by focused urgency as they began to coordinate, calling for additional personnel, adjusting their positions, trying to assess the situation without provoking any sudden reactions. But even as the room filled with quiet, controlled movement, Emily remained completely still, her attention fixed on Koba and the small, hidden figure beyond him. Because in that moment the connection between them felt stronger than ever, not just recognition, not just memory, but trust, the same trust that had been built years ago when he was small and vulnerable, now returning in a way none of them could have expected. And as Koba held his position, watching her, waiting, it became clear that whatever happened next would depend not on force or control, but on whether they could understand what he had been trying to say all along. The moment stretched into something heavier than anyone in the room had expected, as the reality of what they were seeing began to settle in, and the quiet urgency that replaced the earlier tension moved through the staff like a ripple, controlled but undeniable, while Emily remained fixed in place, her eyes moving between Koba and the small figure partially hidden behind the structure, her mind working to connect everything at once. And Koba did not move away, he did not retreat or react to the increased activity around him. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, positioned between the hidden presence and the rest of the enclosure, his body angled in a way that made it clear he was aware of every movement happening outside the glass. Yet he did not show signs of agitation, only a steady alertness that felt protective rather than defensive. And Daniel spoke quickly into his radio, his tone low but precise as he requested a containment check and immediate evaluation of the enclosure's interior, his eyes never leaving Koba, as if trying to anticipate any shift in behavior, while another staff member moved toward the monitoring station, pulling up camera angles that had not been closely reviewed before, and it became clear within seconds that the small figure had gone unnoticed for longer than anyone was comfortable admitting. And Emily felt a wave of disbelief pass through her as she realized that Koba had been aware of it all along, that he had been the only one responding to something that everyone else had missed. And she took another small step, closer to the glass, her voice still soft but steadier now as she spoke again, not with uncertainty, but with understanding. And Koba's reaction was immediate, his posture lowering just slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing as if her tone alone was enough to confirm that she finally understood what he had been trying to show her. And the connection between them shifted again, no longer just recognition or memory, but cooperation, something active, something present. And behind her the staff coordinated quickly, preparing to enter the enclosure through the secondary access point with all necessary precautions, their movements careful, deliberate, designed to avoid triggering any sudden reactions. While Daniel stepped closer to Emily, his voice quieter now, no longer warning her to step back, but asking her to remain exactly where she was, because it was clear that Koba was responding to her presence in a way that could not be replicated by anyone else. And as the secured door on the far side of the enclosure unlocked with a faint mechanical sound, Koba's attention shifted for a brief moment, his head turning slightly toward the source of the noise, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath again, because this was the point where everything could change, where the delicate balance that had been maintained so far could either hold or break. and Emily felt that tension rise again. But this time it was different. Not fear of what Koba might do, but concern for how he might react to others entering his space. And she instinctively raised her hand slightly, not touching the glass this time, just lifting it enough to catch his attention again. And it worked, because Koba looked back at her immediately, his focus returning, grounding him in a way that seemed to stabilize the moment. And the staff inside the enclosure moved slowly, carefully approaching the area where the small figure remained partially hidden, their actions measured and quiet. While Koba did not interfere, he did not advance or retreat. He simply watched, his eyes shifting between Emily and the movement behind him, as if trusting her to understand what needed to happen next. And as the hidden figure became more visible under closer inspection, the weight of the situation deepened even further, because it was no longer just about what had been discovered, but about how it had been discovered. And the realization that Koba had not only recognized Emily after all this time, but had actively guided her to something important, changed everything they thought they understood about him, about memory, about connection. And as Emily stood there, her eyes fixed on him, she felt a quiet certainty settle in, that this moment was not an accident, not coincidence, but something far more meaningful, something that would not be forgotten by anyone who had witnessed it. As the staff carefully approached the hidden corner of the enclosure, the small figure that had gone unnoticed for so long was finally revealed in full, and a quiet wave of relief moved through the room as they realized it was a young gorilla, fragile, still, and clearly in need of attention, its presence raising questions that would take time to answer. But in that moment, all that mattered was that it had been found. And Emily felt her breath release slowly as the tension that had been building inside her finally began to ease, while Koba remained exactly where he was, his posture still calm, still watchful, his eyes moving between Emily and the handlers now tending to the young one. And there was no aggression in him, no resistance, only a steady awareness that seemed to confirm what Emily had already begun to understand, that everything he had done from the moment she arrived had been intentional, purposeful, driven by something deeper than instinct. And Daniel stepped closer to the glass, his voice quieter, now almost reflective as he spoke to the others, acknowledging that Koba had not only recognized Emily, but had used that recognition to communicate something critical, something none of them had been able to see on their own. And the weight of that realization settled over the entire team, changing the way they looked at the animal they thought they understood. And Emily slowly lowered her hand from the glass, her eyes still fixed on Koba. And for a moment it felt as though the noise of the room faded again, leaving only the connection between them, quieter now, steadier, no longer filled with tension or uncertainty, but something closer to calm understanding. And Koba stepped forward once more, not with urgency this time, not with the intensity from before, but with a slower, more measured movement, his gaze softening as he approached the glass again. And when he reached it, he did not tap or signal. He simply rested his hand against the surface, mirroring what he had done earlier. But now the gesture felt different, not a call for attention, not a signal of urgency, but something more final, something that carried a quiet sense of closure. And Emily lifted her hand again, placing it gently against the glass where his was, her fingers steady now, her expression soft as the last of her doubt faded away, because in that moment she no longer questioned whether he remembered her. She knew he did. Not just in fragments, not just in instinct, but in a way that had guided his actions, that had allowed him to trust her even after all this time. And behind her the staff continued their work, carefully preparing to relocate the young gorilla for proper care, their movements efficient but respectful, aware now that they were part of something far more significant than a routine procedure. And Daniel glanced at Emily once more before looking back at Koba, his expression thoughtful, as if reassessing everything he believed about